At 4:47 a.m. on June 17, 1945, Corporal Eugene Francis Doherty pulled a Japanese officer's katana from a dead man's scabbard and prepared to die. He was lying in a shell crater on the northern end of Okinawa, bleeding from wounds in his left shoulder and right thigh, his M1 Garand empty, his .45 pistol down to its last magazine, 7 rounds against what sounded like an entire Japanese company moving through the pre-dawn darkness toward his position. 22 years old, former grocery clerk from Albany, New York, and he had perhaps 3 minutes left to live. He had grown up on Orange Street in the South End, the middle child of 5 in an Irish Catholic family that had lived in Albany for 3 generations. His father worked at the Ford plant on Erie Boulevard. His mother kept house and kept her children in line, and Eugene had spent his childhood doing the things that Albany boys did in the 1930s. Playing stickball in the streets, swimming in the Hudson River, getting into fights with the Italian kids from the North End, and then making friends with them afterward. He had graduated from Philip Livingston High School in 1941, the same year the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Half his graduating class enlisted within 6 months. Eugene had waited until his 18th birthday, had kissed his mother goodbye and shaken his father's hand, and had reported to the Marine Corps recruiting station on Broadway on a cold morning in February 1942. The Marines had taught him to shoot, to fight, to kill. They had shipped him to the Pacific, had sent him into the meat grinder of island warfare, had turned a grocery clerk into something else entirely. By June 1945, he had fought on Saipan and Tinian, had killed men whose faces he still saw in his dreams, had lost count of the friends who had died beside him. He was not the same boy who had left Albany 3 years earlier. That boy was gone, buried somewhere in the volcanic sand of the Pacific Islands. The sword was beautiful, even in the darkness, even through the haze of pain and blood loss. Doherty could see the craftsmanship, the curved blade, the wrapped handle, the faint pattern in the steel that marked it as something more than a simple weapon. The officer he had taken it from was lying 5 feet away, killed by Doherty's last rifle shot. His body sprawled across the edge of the crater, like a man who had simply decided to rest. Doherty had never held a katana before. He had seen them in movies, had heard stories from Marines who had taken them as souvenirs, but he had never felt the weight of one in his hands. It was lighter than he expected, perfectly balanced, the blade catching what little light filtered through the clouds. The edge was sharp enough to shave with. The Japanese officer had kept it immaculate, even in the mud and chaos of Okinawa. The officer would not need it anymore. Neither, Doherty suspected, would he. The battle for Okinawa had been raging for 78 days, and it had broken something in everyone who survived it. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at the American invasion: kamikazes, banzai charges, artillery barrages, suicidal infiltration attacks that came screaming out of the darkness at all hours. The fighting had been brutal, relentless, a grinding war of attrition that had already killed over 12,000 Americans and wounded another 36,000. The numbers didn't capture the reality. They didn't capture the rain that fell for weeks without stopping, turning the island into a sea of mud. They didn't capture the stench of decomposing bodies that hung over the battlefield, so thick you could taste it. They didn't capture the terror of night attacks, of Japanese soldiers who would rather die than surrender, who would charge machine guns with nothing but bayonets and a willingness to kill before they were killed. The Marines called it the Typhoon of Steel, and the name was apt. Artillery shells fell so thickly that they seemed to form a solid ceiling of metal overhead. Mortars dropped out of the sky without warning, exploding in foxholes, in mess lines, in aid stations where wounded men lay waiting for evacuation. There was no safe place on Okinawa. There was no rear area, no respite, no moment when a man could let down his guard and simply breathe. The Japanese were losing. Everyone knew they were losing, but they refused to stop fighting. Their commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had ordered his men to fight to the death, to exact the maximum possible cost from the American invaders. When the battle finally ended, only 7,400 Japanese soldiers would be taken prisoner out of a defending force of over 100,000. The rest would die, many of them in suicidal charges that accomplished nothing but killing and dying. Doherty's unit, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, had been ordered to hold a ridgeline overlooking a valley that the Japanese were using to move reinforcements. The position was tactically important, but nearly impossible to defend. A narrow strip of rocky ground, exposed on 3 sides, with no natural cover and no room for maneuver. The company had dug in as best they could, had waited for the attack that everyone knew was coming. It had come at 3:30 a.m. The Japanese had hit them with everything: mortars, machine guns, infantry assault waves that seemed to materialize out of the darkness itself. Fox Company had held for nearly an hour, had thrown back 3 separate attacks, had killed dozens of Japanese soldiers at the cost of their own dead and wounded. Then the ammunition had started to run low, and the attacks had kept coming, and the line had begun to crumble. Doherty had been on the far left of the company position when the final assault began. He had been part of a 4-man fire team holding a small knoll that anchored the flank, had watched his teammates die one by one as the Japanese worked their way up the slope. Private First Class Tommy Kaczmarek had been the first to fall. He was a Polish kid from Chicago, 19 years old, who had joined the Marines because his older brother had been killed at Guadalcanal, and he wanted revenge. He had been a good rifleman, steady under fire, the kind of man you wanted beside you when things got bad. A Japanese sniper had taken him through the head at 4:15 a.m., a single shot from somewhere in the darkness that had dropped him without a sound. Doherty had crawled to him, had checked for a pulse, had found nothing but blood and stillness. Private Albert Washington had been next. He was from Atlanta, one of the few black Marines in the company, a man who had faced prejudice from his own countrymen and hatred from the enemy, and had fought through both with a quiet dignity that Doherty admired. A grenade had landed in his foxhole at 4:31 a.m., and the explosion had torn open his chest. He had lived long enough to say Doherty's name, long enough to reach for his friend's hand, and then he was gone. Corporal Daniel Reyes had died at 4:39 a.m. He was from San Antonio, a wiry Tejano with a quick smile and a quicker temper, the only man in the fire team who was married. His wife was named Maria, and he had shown Doherty her photograph 100 times. A dark-haired woman with kind eyes and a baby on her hip. A Japanese soldier had come over the lip of the foxhole, bayonet first, and Reyes had met him with his own blade. They had killed each other, tangled together, and Doherty had pulled Reyes's body free and laid him beside Washington and Kaczmarek. 3 friends, 3 good men, dead in less than 30 minutes. Now Doherty was alone, wounded, almost out of ammunition, and the Japanese were coming. He could hear them in the darkness, the rustle of movement, the whispered commands, the distinctive click of rifle bolts being worked. They were close, maybe 50 yards away, maybe less. They knew there was an American position here, knew that the defenders were weakened, knew that one more push would break through the line and open the entire ridge to assault. Doherty had 7 pistol rounds, 7 shots against what sounded like 30 or 40 men. The math was simple and final. He would kill some of them. Maybe 3, maybe 4 if he was lucky. Then they would kill him. The best he could hope for was to buy time, to slow them down long enough for the rest of Fox Company to consolidate, to make his death mean something. But dying quietly was not in Eugene Doherty's nature. He looked at the katana in his hands. The Japanese believed that the soul of a samurai lived in his sword, that the weapon carried the spirit of its owner. The officer he had killed had probably carried this blade through years of war, had maintained it with religious devotion, had believed that it would bring him victory or an honorable death. Doherty was not Japanese. He did not believe in samurai spirits or warrior codes or the mystical properties of ancient steel. He believed in Albany, New York, in his mother's Sunday dinners, in the girl named Catherine who had promised to wait for him. He believed that he wanted to live, that he deserved to live, that it was profoundly unfair that he was probably going to die in a shell crater on an island he had never heard of before the war. But if he was going to die, he was going to die fighting, not hiding in a hole, not waiting for the Japanese to find him, but attacking, charging, making them remember that at least one American had refused to go quietly. He checked his pistol one more time. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 8 shots total. He tucked the pistol into his belt and gripped the katana with both hands. The handle was wrapped in some kind of cord, silk, maybe, or cotton, and it felt strange against his palms, foreign, like holding a piece of another world. The Japanese were 30 yards away now. He could see shapes moving in the darkness, could hear the sound of boots on rock, could smell the gunpowder and sweat and blood that hung over the battlefield like a fog. In another few seconds, they would reach the crater. They would find him. Doherty stood up. If you want to see how a wounded Marine with a samurai sword and 8 bullets held off an entire Japanese assault, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Doherty. The Japanese saw him immediately, a figure rising from the earth, silhouetted against the faint glow of fires burning somewhere behind the American lines, holding something long and curved that gleamed in the darkness. For a single frozen moment, both sides stared at each other, the lone American with a Japanese sword, the Japanese soldiers who had expected to find corpses or cowering survivors. Then Doherty screamed. It was not a word, not a battle cry, not anything coherent. It was simply a sound, a raw, primal noise that came from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound that expressed everything he felt in that moment. The fear, the rage, the absolute refusal to die on his knees. He screamed and he charged. The first Japanese soldier was too surprised to react. Doherty hit him at a dead run, the katana sweeping down in an arc that he had never been taught, that no one had ever shown him. The blade caught the man across the shoulder and neck, and the soldier fell without a sound. Doherty did not stop. He was already moving toward the next man, the sword coming up, his wounded leg screaming in protest. The second soldier managed to raise his rifle, but not quickly enough. Doherty's stroke took him across the chest, and the man staggered backward, colliding with the soldier behind him. For a moment, the Japanese assault wave became a confused tangle of bodies, men trying to bring their weapons to bear on a target that was suddenly among them, rather than ahead of them. Doherty used the confusion. He swung the katana in wide, sweeping arcs, not aiming for any particular target, simply trying to create space around himself, to keep the Japanese off balance. The blade connected with something, an arm, a rifle stock, a shoulder, and someone screamed. Another swing, another impact, and Doherty found himself in a small clearing, surrounded by fallen bodies and Japanese soldiers who were finally beginning to organize a response. A rifle cracked, and something hot tore across Doherty's left side, just above his hip. He ignored it. He was beyond pain now, beyond fear, operating on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate will to survive. He drew his pistol with his left hand, holding the katana in his right, and fired at the nearest Japanese soldier. The man dropped. He fired again, and another man fell. The Japanese were retreating, not all of them. Some were still pushing forward, still trying to overwhelm the lone American. But others were falling back, confused by the ferocity of the resistance, unable to understand how one wounded man could be causing so much chaos. They had expected to sweep over a broken defensive position. Instead, they had found a demon with a sword. Doherty advanced. He did not retreat to his crater, did not try to find cover, did not do any of the things that training and common sense demanded. He walked forward into the Japanese assault, the katana in one hand and the pistol in the other, killing everything that moved. The battle became a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Doherty lost count of the men he killed, some with the katana, some with the pistol, some with his bare hands when the pistol clicked empty and there was no time to reload. He was wounded again, a bayonet thrust that grazed his right arm, and then again a rifle butt that connected with his jaw and sent stars exploding across his vision. He kept fighting. He could not stop fighting. Stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die. The Japanese officer appeared at 5:12 a.m. He was older than the soldiers around him, maybe 40, with a weathered face and a calm expression that seemed wildly out of place in the chaos of the battle. He wore the insignia of a captain, and he carried his own katana, a longer blade than the one Doherty had taken, held in a formal two-handed grip that spoke of years of training. The soldiers around him fell back, creating a space, and Doherty understood what was happening. The captain wanted a duel. Doherty's pistol was empty. His wounds were bleeding freely, the adrenaline beginning to fade, the pain beginning to break through. He had perhaps 5 minutes of fighting left in him, maybe less. The smart thing to do would be to run, to try to reach the American lines, to let someone else deal with the Japanese captain. Doherty was not feeling smart. He was feeling something else, something ancient and primal, something that responded to the challenge in the captain's eyes with a challenge of his own. This man wanted to fight. Fine, they would fight. He raised the katana. The captain nodded slightly, an acknowledgement, perhaps even a mark of respect, and then he attacked. His first strike was a lightning blow from the shoulder, a classic kendo technique that would have split Doherty's skull if it had landed. Doherty managed to block it, barely, the impact jarring through his arms, sending a shock of pain through his wounded shoulder. The captain flowed past him, spinning, the blade coming around for another strike from an impossible angle. Doherty ducked, felt the steel whisper over his head, close enough to part his hair, and swung his own weapon at the captain's exposed side. The stroke was clumsy, untrained, the desperate swing of a man who had never held a sword before tonight. The captain parried effortlessly, his blade redirecting Doherty's with minimal motion, and countered with a thrust that nearly opened Doherty's throat. The captain was faster than Doherty, more skilled, more experienced with the weapon. Every movement was precise, economical, the product of years of training that Doherty could not begin to match. A Japanese officer of his rank would have studied kendo since childhood, would have practiced the sword as a spiritual discipline as much as a martial art. He was fighting an amateur, and he knew it. But Doherty had something the captain did not. Absolute disregard for his own survival. He attacked recklessly, swinging the katana in patterns that no Japanese swordsman would recognize, that no training had ever produced. He was not fighting with technique. He was fighting with fury, the accumulated rage of 3 years of war, of friends killed, of horrors witnessed, of a young man from Albany who had been turned into something he barely recognized. The duel lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It felt like hours. The two men circled each other, struck, parried, struck again, their blades meeting with a sound like bells ringing in the pre-dawn darkness. Doherty took a cut across his left forearm that laid the muscle open to the bone. The captain took a gash across his thigh that made him stumble, just for a moment. That moment was enough. Doherty stepped inside the captain's guard and drove the katana forward with everything he had left. The blade entered the captain's chest just below the sternum, punching through the uniform, through the flesh, through the man who had wanted an honorable death and had found one at the hands of a grocery clerk from Albany. The captain's eyes widened. He looked down at the blade in his chest, then up at Doherty, and something that might have been respect flickered across his face. He said something in Japanese, a single word that Doherty did not understand, and then he fell, taking the katana with him, leaving Doherty standing alone in a circle of dead men with empty hands and nothing left to fight with. The Japanese soldiers around them had watched the duel in silence. Now they stared at the American who had killed their captain, at the bodies scattered across the slope, at the evidence of what one wounded man had accomplished against impossible odds. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a shot rang out from the American lines, a sniper maybe, or just a rifleman who had seen movement, and the spell was broken. The Japanese fell back, not in a rout, but in an organized withdrawal, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead. They had come to break through the American line. Instead, they had found something that defied explanation. Doherty stood swaying in the pre-dawn light, his wounds bleeding, his hands empty, watching the Japanese disappear into the darkness. He did not understand why they were retreating. He did not understand why he was still alive. He simply stood there, waiting for something to happen, his body beginning to shut down, now that the immediate threat had passed. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first gray hints of dawn appearing over the Pacific. Doherty could see the outline of the ridge now, could see the scattered bodies of his enemies, could see the devastation he had wrought in less than 30 minutes of killing. 15 men. He had killed 15 men, most of them with a weapon he had never used before, in a battle that should have lasted seconds before they overwhelmed him. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood, his own and others, mixed together until he couldn't tell the difference. They were shaking, trembling so badly that he couldn't have held a weapon even if he'd had one. The adrenaline was draining away, and what remained was exhaustion, pain, and something else. A hollow feeling in his chest that he would carry for the rest of his life. He had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, against everything that military doctrine said should have happened, he had survived. But the men he had killed would not survive. They had been soldiers, doing their duty, following orders, and he had cut them down like animals. The Japanese captain had wanted an honorable death, and Doherty had given it to him. But what honor was there in any of this? What honor was there in war? The first American voices reached him, and Doherty turned toward them like a sleepwalker turning toward light. Holy shit! The speaker was Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, a squad leader from 2nd Platoon who had led a counterattack to reinforce the left flank. O'Brien stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the bodies, counting them. "Holy shit, Doherty! What did you do?" Doherty looked at him. His vision was blurring, the blood loss finally catching up with him, and O'Brien seemed to shimmer and waver like a mirage. "I charged them," he said. His voice sounded strange, distant. "They were coming and I was out of ammo, so I charged them." "With a sword?" "It was the officers, the dead one over there." Doherty gestured vaguely toward the first crater, toward the body of the Japanese officer whose katana had started everything. "I didn't have anything else." O'Brien walked through the clearing, counting bodies. He counted 11 Japanese soldiers killed by blade wounds, another 4 with bullet holes. He found the captain with Doherty's katana still in his chest, found the evidence of the duel in the pattern of footprints and blood on the rocky ground. When he finished counting, he came back to Doherty and grabbed him by the shoulders. "You killed 15 men," O'Brien said, "by yourself, with a sword and a pistol. Do you understand what you did?" Doherty understood that he was very tired, that his wounds hurt more than anything had ever hurt in his life, and that he wanted to sit down. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply collapsed, his legs finally giving out, and O'Brien caught him before he hit the ground. Corman up!" The next hours were a blur of pain and voices and movement. Corman bandaged his wounds, 5 separate injuries, including the gunshot graze to his side and the deep cut across his forearm. Stretcher bearers carried him back to the aid station, where a doctor took one look at him and ordered immediate evacuation to a hospital ship. He had lost nearly 2 pints of blood. By all rights, he should have been dead. But Eugene Doherty had never done anything by rights. The sword stayed with the captain's body. Doherty had not thought to retrieve it, and by the time anyone realized it might be valuable as a souvenir, the graves registration teams had already collected the Japanese dead. The katana that had killed 15 men, or 11, depending on how you counted, disappeared into the chaos of war, never to be seen again. Doherty spent 3 weeks on the hospital ship USS Mercy, recovering from his wounds. The ship was anchored off Okinawa, receiving a constant stream of casualties from the ongoing battle, and Doherty shared a ward with men who had been burned, shot, shattered by explosions, broken in every way that war could break a human being. The doctors were amazed he had survived. The blood loss alone should have killed him, and the wound to his forearm had come within millimeters of severing a major artery. They asked him how he had kept fighting with such severe injuries, and he told them the truth. He hadn't noticed. The adrenaline had been so intense that the pain simply hadn't registered until the fighting stopped. A chaplain visited him on his 3rd day aboard. Father Michael Brennan, a Navy lieutenant with kind eyes and a Boston accent, sat beside his bed and asked if he wanted to talk about what had happened. Doherty declined. He didn't know how to put it into words. The fear, the fury, the strange clarity that had come over him when he picked up the sword. He didn't know how to explain what it felt like to kill a man with a blade, to feel the steel slide through flesh, to watch the life leave someone's eyes from inches away. Some things could not be confessed because they could not be described. The nightmare started on the hospital ship and would continue for years. He dreamed of the Japanese captain, of the moment their blades had met, of the single Japanese word the man had spoken before he died. He dreamed of Kazmarek and Washington and Reyes, of their faces in the darkness, of the friends he had failed to save. He woke sweating, shaking, reaching for a weapon that was not there. The other patients in the ward learned not to wake him from these dreams. One man had tried, and Doherty had nearly strangled him before he came fully awake. The Marines awarded him the Navy Cross. The citation described his extraordinary heroism and his complete disregard for his own safety in the face of overwhelming enemy assault. It praised his unprecedented courage in engaging superior enemy forces in close combat, accounting for 15 enemy killed and contributing materially to the successful defense of his unit's position. It did not mention the katana by name, referring only to an enemy officer's sword. Some things were too strange to put in official documents. Doherty returned to duty in August 1945, just in time for the Japanese surrender. He had missed the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign, had missed the atomic bombs and the Emperor's announcement, had learned about the end of the war from a nurse who came into his hospital room with tears streaming down her face. The war was over. He had survived. He went home to Albany in October 1945. Catherine was waiting for him at the train station, just as she had promised, wearing the blue dress she had worn on their last date before he shipped out. He had written her dozens of letters during the war, but he had never told her about Okinawa, about the crater, about the sword. Some things you did not write in letters, some things you did not tell anyone. They married in December 1945, in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church. Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, and Eugene wore his Marine Corps dress blues, the Navy Cross ribbon visible above his heart. The reception was held at the Knights of Columbus Hall, and Eugene's father gave a toast that made everyone cry, a toast about sons who go to war and the grace of God that sometimes brings them home. Doherty went back to work at the grocery store where he had worked before the war, a small market on Lark Street owned by a man named Sal Benedetto. Sal had kept Eugene's job open through 3 years of war, had written him letters, and sent him packages of Italian cookies and salami. When Eugene came home, Sal embraced him like a son and put him to work stocking shelves, running the register, learning the business from the ground up. Eugene bought the store from Sal in 1952, when Sal retired to Florida to be near his grandchildren. He renamed it Doherty's Market and ran it for the next 30 years, becoming a fixture of the Lark Street neighborhood. He knew every customer by name, extended credit to families who were struggling, donated food to the church pantry every week. He was not trying to be a good man. He was trying to become someone different from the person he had been on Okinawa, someone who gave life instead of taking it. He and Catherine had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and raised them in a house on Madison Avenue, a brick colonial with a backyard where Doherty grew tomatoes in the summer and coached his sons' Little League teams. The boys, Michael, Patrick, and Thomas, grew up knowing their father was a war hero, but not knowing why. The girl, Mary Catherine, born in 1954, was Eugene's favorite, though he would never have admitted it. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was the only one who could make him laugh when the darkness came over him. He never spoke about the sword. When his children asked about the war, he told them about the friends he had made, about the places he had seen, about the funny things that happened in boot camp. He did not tell them about the pre-dawn darkness on Okinawa, about the 15 men he had killed, about the Japanese captain who had wanted a duel and had found death instead. Those memories belonged to a different person, a 22-year-old grocery clerk who had somehow become a killer, and Doherty kept them locked away where they could not touch his family. In 1987, a Marine Corps historian named Captain David Thornton contacted Doherty while researching a book about close combat in the Pacific War. Thornton had found the after-action reports, had read the Navy Cross citation, had tracked down O'Brien and other survivors who remembered the night of June 17th. He flew to Albany, sat in Doherty's living room, and asked him to describe what had happened. Doherty was 64 years old then, retired from the grocery business, his hair gray and his hands spotted with age. Catherine sat beside him, hearing the story for the first time in 42 years of marriage. She held his hand as he spoke, her grip tightening with each detail. "I've always wondered," Thornton said when Doherty finished, "what made you charge? You were wounded, outnumbered, out of ammunition. Most men would have surrendered or tried to hide or just waited to die. But you charged. Why?" Doherty was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Catherine, at the photographs of his children and grandchildren on the mantelpiece, at the ordinary American life he had built in the decades since the war. "I was scared," he said finally, "more scared than I've ever been in my life. I knew I was going to die. There was no question about it. 30 Japanese soldiers, and me with 8 bullets and a sword I didn't know how to use. But dying scared felt wrong. Dying on my knees, waiting for them to find me. That wasn't how I wanted to go. So, you charged." "So I charged. I figured if I was going to die, I might as well die doing something. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I thought if I was crazy enough, if I was scary enough, they might hesitate. They might give me a chance. He paused. I didn't expect to survive. I really didn't. But I survived the first man, and then the second, and then somehow I was still alive and they were running, and I still don't understand how any of it happened. Thornton's book was published in 1989. A full chapter covered Doherty's action on Okinawa, including photographs of the terrain and excerpts from the Navy Cross citation. The chapter was titled The Sword in the Darkness. Eugene Francis Doherty died on April 3, 2007, at the age of 84. Kidney failure, the doctor said, after a long decline that had begun 2 years earlier. He passed at home, in the house on Madison Avenue, with Catherine and their children around him. He was buried at the Gerald B. H. Solomon Saratoga National Cemetery, his Navy Cross displayed at the funeral, his service to his country honored by a Marine Corps Honor Guard. At the funeral, his oldest son, Michael, spoke about what his father had meant to him. He talked about the Little League games, the backyard barbecues, the quiet wisdom that his father had dispensed over decades of ordinary life. And then at the end, he talked about the sword. Dad never told us about Okinawa until we were adults. He didn't think it was something children should hear. But when we finally learned what he did, when we read Captain Thornton's book and understood what our father had done, we asked him about it. We asked him how he felt about killing 15 men. Michael paused, composing himself. He said he didn't feel proud. He said he didn't feel like a hero. He said he felt sorry for them, for the Japanese soldiers who had just been doing their jobs, who had families back home just like he did. He said war made everyone a victim, even the people who survived. But then he said something else. He said that even though he felt sorry for them, he didn't regret what he did, because on that ridge, in that darkness, it was them or him, and he wanted to live. He wanted to come home and marry Mom and have us, and if that meant picking up a sword and charging 30 men, then that's what he was going to do. That's what I learned from my father. Not that violence is good or that killing is heroic, but that sometimes, when everything else has failed, you have to be willing to do whatever it takes to protect the things you love, even if it terrifies you, even if it seems impossible. You charge anyway. 15 dead, 1 sword, a man who wanted to live badly enough to become something he never imagined. The katana that Eugene Doherty used on Okinawa was never recovered. No museum displays it. No collector owns it. It vanished into history, along with the Japanese captain who carried it, and the soldier who took it and used it to survive. But the story remains. The story of a grocery clerk from Albany who was wounded, alone, and out of ammunition, and who charged anyway. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now, their stories fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.